Right, this video is another worked example of comparative advantage, which I know is something that people find difficult to get their heads around. So remember, a comparative advantage is where one country can produce at a lower relative opportunity cost than another economy. Now for this, we make lots and lots of assumptions. It's based on the Ricardian sort of theory. So what we're going to assume is that what we've got two countries. And in my example here, we're going to have the Germans and we're going to have the French. Now, what I'm also going to assume is that these two economies literally produce two goods and services. We have toasters and we have kettles. So everyone's wants and needs are met by these two goods. So it means the resources, the factor endowment in these economies are literally used to produce toasters and or kettles. So everyone's wants and needs are met by these two different items. I'm also going to assume that these goods are homogeneous, which means that toasters and kettles produced in both economies are identical, so people don't prefer which one they have. Now what we're looking at in this table is the hours to produce these two different items. Okay, now what I'm going to assume is that if we look at Germany first of all, the Germans require 8 hours to produce a toaster. They can produce a kettle in 4 hours. The French, it's 1 for each. So 1 hour to produce a toaster, 1 hour to produce a kettle. Now if we were basing this on the theory of absolute advantage, the French could produce both toasters and kettles cheaper than what the Germans can. So based on this, what you would argue is, why would the French want to trade with the Germans? Well, what we have to think about is the relative opportunity cost. So what we're now going to think about is this, the opportunity cost. So let's think first of all about toasters. And if we think about the Germans, and we think about the French. Okay, now in Germany, in the time it takes to make one toaster, which is 8 hours, then the opportunity cost would be 2 kettles. Okay, simply because it takes 4 hours to make one kettle, so 8 hours to make a toaster. So in the 8 hours to make a toaster, you can make 2 kettles. In France, one toaster is 1 kettle. Okay, so for every kettle that is made in France, they lose 1 toaster and vice versa. Now, one other assumption that we make here is that the resources in these economies are transferable. So in other words, resources can easily be transferred from making kettles to toasters and vice versa. Again, it's another quirk or inaccuracy of the theory in many ways, because obviously in reality, resources cannot be transferred that easily. When we think about kettles, we've got different opportunity costs to think about here. So we think about the Germans, and we think about the French. So for every kettle made in Germany, they will sacrifice 0.5 toasters. Okay, think about why. It's 4 hours to produce a kettle. In that 4 hours, you could produce half a toaster, because it takes 8 hours to make a toaster. In France, 1 kettle, again, will be 1 toaster. Now let's think about the relative opportunity costs. Now when we look at toasters, what we would argue is, and prove, is that the French can produce toasters at a lower relative opportunity cost than the Germans can. They only sacrificed 1 kettle to make a toaster, whereas the Germans have to sacrifice 2. When it comes to kettles, we see the Germans have got the comparative advantage at these. Okay, so when we look at the Germans, for example, here, for every 1 kettle they make, they lose half a toaster. The French lose a full toaster. So based on this, then, what we would argue is that the French should focus mainly anyway on the production of toasters. That's what they have the relative opportunity cost in. And the Germans should focus at kettles production. Now And what we can now do is to think about total production. And I'm just going to base this on a 24-hour period of time. So we're now looking at production. And what I'm going to focus on, first of all, is production before trade. So here, there is no trade at all, which means that the Germans and French have to make their own toasters and own kettles. Right, so we've got toasters and we've got kettles. So what I'm going to assume is that in these two economies, they decide to allocate 50% of their time, or their resources if you like, to making toasters, and 50% of their time for making kettles. So with this in mind, in this 24-hour period, 12 hours is dedicated towards toaster production and 12 hours towards kettle production. Right, let's think about what will be produced in this time then. Now in Germany, it takes 8 hours to produce a toaster. So that would mean in 12 hours, they could produce 1.5 toasters. The French, only 1 hour to make a toaster, so in 12 hours they could make 12. When it comes to kettles, in 12 hours, well, the Germans require 4 hours to make a kettle, which means in 12 hours they could make 3. The French, again, it's 1 hour to make a kettle, so they could make 12 in total. Now, what this means is that global production of toasters is 13.5. Kettles comes in at 15. Okay, now what comparative advantage shows us is that if these economies specialise in some way, then it can lead to an increase in total global production. So we're now looking at production after trade. So again, what we do is we draw this table. So we've got the Germans, we've got the French, we've got the total production, we've got toasters, and we've got kettles. So let's just draw this table. Right, what we're now going to assume then is that both countries will focus, mainly anyway, on the production of the good or service that they have got I suppose they can produce the lowest relative opportunity cost. Now before, on the last page, let's go back a second, we said the Germans have got the comparative advantage at kettle production. The French have got the comparative advantage at toasters. So the Germans should focus mainly on the production of kettles. So what I'm going to assume is the Germans now decide that they will dedicate 0 hours to toaster production in this 24-hour period, which means they make 0 toasters. Okay, now what I'm also going to assume then is that 24 hours in this country are being used simply to make kettles. It's 4 hours in Germany to make 1 kettle, so in 24 hours they can now make 6 kettles. Now the French, in my example, it might decide all we're going to do is to partly specialise. So what they're going to do is to use 10 hours to make kettles. 1 hour to make a kettle, which means they can make 10 altogether. So that means global production of kettles is now at 16. It's gone up by 1. So there's 1 more kettle knocking around that we didn't have before. Now what this also means then is that the French have got 14 hours left over to make toasters. Okay, and as we showed before, it's 1 hour to make a toaster in this country. So that means this 14 hours they've got left over, they can make 14 toasters. So that means that global production of toasters is now up to 14. So what we can see is the big benefit of trade based on comparative advantage. If economies focus on producing what they've got the comparative advantage at, in this example here, global production of both toasters and kettles will increase, which in theory should mean that people's economic welfare should also increase.